Um, there we go. So that's just a little bit about Agara. I'll pass it on to Mickey or Sarah to talk a little bit about SciComm.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you so much. This is also SciComm's first collaboration with another club, so very excited on our front too. As Arjun said, my name is Mickey. I am the founder of SciComm at JHU a couple of years ago, so I'm super pumped to be putting on this event for you guys tonight and really glad that everyone carved time out of their busy midterm-ridden schedule to be here. So a little bit about SciComm in case you aren't familiar. We are a science communication focused club on campus. So we're also expanding that to research communication in general. But we started with a science focus, hence SciComm. But our goal is to improve undergraduates' ability to read science, to write science, and to present science effectively with the overall goal of increasing science transparency and research transparency in the future. So that's a little bit about us. And if you have any more questions, feel free to like private message me or whatever. But with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to our first SciComm presenter for the next set of slides. Oh, wait, I'll introduce the 5 C's of academic writing. We'll jump right in. So these are the 5 C's. It's not a hard and fast rule, and you may not have heard of it before, or you may have, but this is a good set of when you want to write a proposal, things that you want to consider, especially when you're writing academically, because we're all in such specialized fields. If you're at the point where you're writing about something in science, you probably know a lot more about it than the people who are going to be reading it. So to consider your clarity, conciseness, cohesion, coherence, and conviction. This set of slides actually came from Melanie Johnson, who is a grad student at the med school. And from her reading and tweeting science course, and we're using the slides with her permission. So with that, I will now kick it off to our first SciComm presenter.
Can I request control the screen? Okay. Wait, how do I click on the slides? Oh, okay, yeah. So clarity is the first C you want to address in your scientific writing. And like it says here, you want straightforward points to facilitate understanding of the material. And here are the main points to keep in mind when addressing clarity. And number 1 is avoiding subject-verb separation, which can be done by decreasing the number of words between your subject and the verb that applies to it. And number 2 is avoiding long clauses, which means avoiding long sentences like run-ons. And number 3 is avoiding unambiguous word choice because you don't want your reader to misinterpret your writing. And number 4 is avoiding strings of nouns, which is just nouns following one after the other, like a list. And it can become very confusing, like you'll see in a later example. And lastly, you want to define all abbreviations, at least when you first mention them. A quick example of that would be to write Alzheimer's disease and then putting a parentheses around AD after it. And here is an example where we want to fix subject-verb separation and long clauses. And it reads, this observation coupled with additional tests of penicillin-induced bacterial killing, as well as purification and synthesis of the active agent, led to the mass production and distribution of penicillin in 1945. You may have thought that this sentence could be helped by allowing the reader to take a breath in the middle. So how can we fix this? And the floor is open for suggestions, and there's no judgment here, by the way. We're all here to learn anyways. You can type it in the chat if you want, but I don't think I can see. Feel free to speak out.
I guess you could remove the from like couple to agent, like you can remove that and put it in a different sentence, and yeah, just have like no separation between subject and the verb in this case.
Yeah, exactly. So here's one version of how it could be revised, and I think it's just addressing what you said. So the subject, which is observation, and the verb led is brought closer together, shown in red, and then that allows the reader to see what purpose the observation serves immediately. And notice how the next sentence begins with the observation, shown in yellow. And writing the observation at the beginning of the next sentence helps avoid using an ambiguous word like it. And then the green part was treated as a sentence on its own to avoid becoming a long clause in the red box above. And here's an example of avoiding a string of nouns. The red part in the top box shows what a string of nouns may look like and how could we fix this one. So any suggestions here? It's super simple. Anyone?
Maybe protection regulations for animal rights.
Yeah, that's one way. Well, so another way that we could fix it would be like this. And in the box below, the string of nouns is rearranged, so similar to what you did. And one trick used here is turning a noun into an action, like protection becoming protect. And the next of the 5 C's is conciseness, and it means using the least number of words to clearly express an idea. And conciseness can be achieved by removing unnecessary words or phrases and by replacing phrases with a single word when possible. So let's examine the example below. All of my research thus far has been directed towards this endeavor of understanding post-transcriptional regulation of gene expression in the context of animal development. So how can we improve this sentence? If you went already, you're free to go again. There's no limit.
I don't really think you need the all of my research thus far part.
Yeah, exactly. So if you look here, like you said, we're gonna cross out all of that and then make the sentence below. Great. So conciseness adds the first C, clarity, like I previously talked about too. And next is, I believe, cohesion.
Hi, my name is Sophia, and I'll be talking about cohesion. I'm not really quite sure how to take control of the screen, so if someone could do the slides for me, I'd greatly appreciate that. So cohesion is the flow of sentences and paragraphs from one to another. So with cohesion, you want to connect sentences and paragraphs with transitions, and you want to ask yourself 2 questions. 1, does it flow? And 2, does it make sense at the sentence level? If we look at this excerpt, thank you. For example, this is an excerpt. Phosmidomycin is known to enter cells by the glycerol-3 phosphate transporter GLPT. Studies of phosmidomycin entry mechanism are largely conducted in rich growth medium, where the effects of GLPT deletion are dramatic. GLPT is tightly regulated by catabolite repression machinery in M9 glucose and is unlikely to be a major mechanism for phosmidomycin uptake. We determined phosmidomycin activity against the GLPT strain in M9 glucose. I don't know about you, but for me, reading that was very clunky and very difficult. It was kind of hard to get through because there's no transitions between any of the sentences, and the sentences didn't really flow from one to another. So if we look at the revised example, we've added transitions. So phosmidomycin is known to enter cells by the glycerol-3 phosphate transporter GLPT. However, studies of phosmidomycin entry mechanism are largely conducted in rich growth medium, where the effects of GLPT deletion are dramatic. Pertinent to the study, GLPT is tightly regulated by catabolite repression machinery in M9 glucose and is therefore unlikely to be a major mechanism for phosmidomycin uptake. To further establish that GLPT does not contribute to phosmidomycin uptake under this condition, we determined phosmidomycin activity against the GLPT strain in M9 glucose. By simply adding transition words, this excerpt became a lot less clunky, and although longer, it did seem to make more sense and have more clarity. Therefore, it's important to connect sentences and paragraphs with transitions and ensure that they flow.
Okay, so the next section is coherence, and that's just making sure that your ideas are presented and making sure that they're logical and consistent. So coherence, like the first thing to take into account is whether your ideas are logical, consistent, and does it make sense? Do the ideas make sense? So here's an example of something that might not make that much sense when reading it. So the hotel is famous. It is one of the most well-known hotels in the country. The latest international dancing competition was held at the hotel. The hotel spent a lot of money to advertise the event because the hotel wanted to gain international reputation, but not many people attended the event. So I don't know about you, but when I read this, I'm not really understanding what exactly this is trying to tell me. And also there's a lot of sentence fragments and just the whole thing just doesn't have a logical flow to it. It just seems like it's all over the place. So does anyone have any ideas on how you might improve this passage?
I guess one way would be to take out the first two sentences and then start of the third sentence, but then at the end of the third sentence, add that the dancing competition was held at one of the most well-known hotels in the country, for one suggestion.
Yeah, that's a good idea to kind of combine some of the sentences so that there's not a lot of redundant things, and also to make sure that it's kind of, I guess, certain things don't need their own sentence. So this is an example of a revised version that was provided. I think they kind of did what Faith just mentioned, where they took the first two sentences and put it at the end of the third sentence. So the latest international dancing competition was held at the hotel, which is one of the most well-known hotels in the region. The hotel spent a lot of money on advertising the event since it wanted to enhance its international reputation. However, it failed to attract many people. So not only is this more it's shorter, it's cleaner, and it just makes more sense because, for instance, one thing that I didn't get when I first read the example version before it was revised was that it failed to attract many people because it, even though it spent a lot of money to advertise the event, and that becomes clear when it's revised. And so making sure that your whole thing is coherent ensures that your actual ideas are conveyed in the way that they were intended to. And so the next section is conviction. And so since you're communicating your science to an audience, it's important for not only the audience to understand it, but for them to believe and trust what you're actually communicating. So one of the big things to look for when you're trying to ensure that you have conviction in your writing is to make sure you use active tense instead of passive tense. An example is frogs were studied versus we studied frogs. And don't be afraid to use personal expressions such as we, because that ties you to your work. And it also, in a lot of cases, the active tense involves using personal expressions such as we. And it makes it more persuasive because it makes it seem like you did the work and you did the science, which you did. Whereas if you did a passive tense, like frogs were studied, who studied the frogs, who was doing the studying? It's not clear that you studied the frogs. And in terms of word choice, avoid weak words and phrases like appears or seems, and instead use words like shows, illustrates, demonstrates. And that's a really easy way to make sure that your writing is persuasive and that it's not you're not even hyping up your writing. You're just ensuring that what was done is conveyed and people know the exact extent, the legitimacy of your work. So an example of something that might not have conviction is phosmidomycin activity was compared in delta GLPT and parent E. coli strains. So I guess, does anyone have any thoughts on this example?
I guess.
Oh, no, you can go.
I went last time, so go ahead.
So I would say we compared phosmide or whatever activity in GLP to parent E. coli strains.
Yeah, so I guess changing it from the passive tense to an active tense. And yeah, that's what the revised version in the example also provided. It's we compared phosmidomycin activity in Delta GLPT versus parent E. coli strains. And it's like the sentence is the same length, and it's not like you had to do any like big like changes, but this small change like makes it much more persuasive because it's like it has conviction now. So additional tips in terms of wait. Yeah, so some additional tips is to ensure that like your materials and method section, they often use past tense, and the abstract, introduction, results, and discussion sections largely use present tense, and the conclusion uses a mix of both. And also rehearse. So ask yourself, like when you're like rehearsing, is this slide really necessary, and is it getting my point across? Because everything should have a reason to be there. Otherwise, it's distracting from the things that actually have a reason to be there. And use all the help you can get, because it's always easier as like a third person who's not personally attached to your work to see whether your work actually does a good job of conveying what you want it to convey, and whether it actually has like the 5 C's. Because as like an external person, they might not be as I guess like involved in your work, and so they'll be able to point out, oh, this is unclear, or this lacks conviction, and so or this not cohesive, and that would be like very helpful. Oops.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, guys. Another thing that I like to do that's just like a personal preference for presenting or for writing is to act like I'm presenting it, to read it out loud and say like, does this make sense? To read it out loud to a family member who might not know that much about science. I mean, obviously it depends on who you're submitting your proposal to, who you're submitting the scientific writing to. But generally, if my family can't follow like sentence to sentence, I know it's, you know, they might not know all the details, but I know that that means that I'm not abiding by these 5 rules. These 5 rules should make at least like sentence structure, what's leading to what, here are the steps. They might not know every word or every concept, but those are the basics that I can ensure by practicing presentations to them. Cool. So kind of moving into the next little pitfall, I guess, of scientific writing, which is jargon. So let's just, you know, jargon is kind of a jargony word anyway. So what do you guys think jargon is? What are some words that come to mind? Some examples of jargon? How would you define it?
I think jargon is just words that are very specific to the field that you're writing about.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know how people like to say mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell? It's like the opposite of that, I guess.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's definitely true. That it's always it's generally pretty field specific. That's definitely a great answer. Any other ideas, examples of jargon?
I guess to bring in another field, another example, like outside of medicine, kind of be like legalese. You know how we describe, you know, those very, you know, Latin heavy words that only a specific subset of a population would truly understand, is not something that can be easily discernible from like a normal, just average day person. So that's what comes to mind when I think of jargon.
Yeah, definitely legal jargon. Like that's that's usually the word that goes in front of jargon, right? Is legal jargon. Yeah, no, that's a great example. Like de facto. I remember I was in my high school history class and my teacher kept saying de facto, and I was like, I don't know what that means. Will you please just say real words? I googled it later, but any other ideas about jargon? Okay, I think you guys hit the nail on the head. Some words that might come to mind is that it's specialized, it's technical, it's context dependent, it's only in specific areas, obscure, might be an acronym or something like that. And these are a lot of the things that we find frustrating when we try to learn science. So, like I just gave that example of my high school teacher, although I was able to like try and learn around that, it was like a block in my mind, like every time he used that word, I was like, I spent some time trying to figure out what that word meant. Although I could probably figure it out from context, I spent some time learning what that word meant, trying to figure it out, as opposed to just purely engaging with the material. Did I understand it as well as I could have? Maybe not. If he would have used more clear words, that might have helped. So we're going to try and avoid jargon as much as possible in our writing, and we're going to give you some tips for that. So yeah, like you guys said, it's a specialized technical vocabulary terms that are associated with situational context, rarely used outside of those circumstances. You run into this a lot, especially in science, I feel like, because there's like specific journals, right? When you're in immunology, do you really need to write out T cell receptor every time you want to refer to a T cell receptor? Can't you just put TCR? You're in an immunology journal, but if anyone outside of that context wants to read that, you've just made it another, gateway that they have to get through to get to your content, which ultimately makes science less accessible, which is ultimately bad for everybody. So why does jargon exist? Like, if it's so bad, if it's such a bad thing, like, why does it exist in the first place? Any ideas? We all hate it when it's like not in our field. Every time, when I talk about my history teacher, right? I hate it when it's not in my field. But when it's in my field, I fall into the traps of using it all the time. Any ideas on why we have this tendency to do this?
Because it's really specific.
Right. Yeah. That's a great reason, because it is specific and it sums up an idea in that field in like a couple of words, as opposed to re-explaining it every time. That's one reason for sure. Any other ideas?
I guess it's easier to convey the meaning within the community. Like you probably like think that you're just writing for your community.
Right.
I feel.
Yeah, for sure. Within a community, like if I say John, there's so many Johns in the world, like I have to be more specific. But when I'm in a club and there's one member of that club named John, I can just refer to John, right? And it's easier for everyone. We all know what we're talking about, right? That's another great reason. I think the reason that my high school history teacher was using was because it makes you sound smart to say de facto all the time, right? There's this pressure in science a lot of times that we want to appear smart. We want to appear like our science is cutting edge. We want to appear that our science is something that you couldn't even try to understand if you wanted to. We're so smart. This is why you got to publish us, right? Like, these are big ideas in science that are prevalent beyond just, our proposals that we're writing for grants or our scholarship applications. This is a grand scheme problem. So yeah, just like you all said, demonstrating expertise, right, and making yourself seem smarter, referring to specialized ideas, and referring to very specific ideas. So what are some examples of jargon in each of these settings, right? Demonstrating expertise, I think you can find literally any use of jargon. Basically, I think you could say is demonstrating expertise, right? That you know this thing, which makes your science seem fancy. An example of using your ideas in a specialized manner is this idea of like strength and hardness and toughness are all different things, but in common language, we use them. Ooh, I'm so sorry. We use them interchangeably, right? We say strength, toughness, hardness, those are all the same thing. But in science, those mean very different things and cannot be used interchangeably. So, that's kind of a form of jargon, is to use one of those and not mean all of the other meanings, and to specify what hardness means in this context versus others. And then very specific ideas in a concise manner. We have, saturation curve, right? We have processing fluency, cross product, the Likert scale, right? These are all concepts that once you've learned them, you know what they are. But if someone was trying to approach your proposal or your paper from not being within that context or being in another context. I mean, saturation curve can mean a million things. I think artists use saturation curves, right? When they're doing their design, and they're going to come in and read your biology paper and say, well, I know what a saturation curve is, and have the totally wrong idea, right? So these are all reasons that it exists, and reasons simultaneously that we should try to avoid it. So if you use jargon, one of the reasons that we want to avoid it is because people will have a hard time understanding your idea, which is always bad. I mean, we're writing because we want people to understand us, right? People will support your idea less, maybe, because they're confused. You lost them for a half a second while they were reading over that word, right? And they might find your idea kind of risky because they don't know what the words are necessarily. So it's kind of counterproductive to this idea of appearing smart, right? Because they don't know what it is. And so they're like, well, I don't know what you're saying, so I'm not going to fund your project, you know? So appearing, you can sound very intelligent. In fact, you can sometimes sound even more intelligent when people know what you're talking about, you know, when you're explaining yourself well. I think we've all had professors, right? There's a professor who's, you know, pretty smart, you know, but kind of bumbles over and is because they're living in their own world, you know, and they know this science so well, they know this concept so well that you don't know what they're saying. And you're like, well, whatever, you know. But then when there's a professor who explains it so well, you're like, wow, that person's really smart. They know what they're talking about. They can explain it to me. It's so much more impressive that way. So let's try and figure out some ways to avoid jargon. We now know it's a bad thing, right? So here's an example. So in this sentence, what phrase or words or word would you guys think is an example of jargon that we should address?
Quasi-equilibrium.
Ooh, smart. Yeah, that's the one. That's the big one, right? Quasi-equilibrium. Like, again, although you can take it apart, you can say, okay, quasi, like quasimodo, right? So like half equilibrium. What's equilibrium in this case? Heat transfer equilibrium. So one thing we can do is to explain very briefly what we think quasi-equilibrium is, right? One, which is really slow, so we can assume all properties stay constant, right? Although we could have maybe come to that conclusion ourselves, this takes that guesswork out of it. This takes that half second where we're like, okay, quasi-equilibrium, equilibrium and heat transfer is, this takes it out. They can read it more effectively. And when someone's sitting there and reading your paper, reading proposals all day, that half second that they save there is gonna make them like your proposal all the more, right? So yes, there was like a quick loss in concision, right? Conciseness. I don't know if that's a word, but it's a little bit longer, right? But there are some trade-offs here. Okay, another way is to just take some of these words. So like heightened scrutiny, right? What's another way to say heightened scrutiny without sounding like we're like fancy, like tea drinking with the pinky up, like, oh, heightened scrutiny. Like what other words would you use on like a daily basis?
Increased skepticism.
Increased skepticism. That's a good one. That's a good one. Any others? Look carefully. I mean, just observe carefully, you know, it's something like that. We're looking carefully, heightened scrutiny. How about intrinsic dissimilarities?
Natural differences.
Natural differences. That's a strong one. Fundamental differences. Yeah. Yep. That's a good one. This one's kind of snarky.
Water boiling.
Yep, water is boiling, right? So great job. That was a good one. I don't think I would have gotten it, but yeah. So that's just kind of an example of how you can smart up all of your words as much as you want, but the content's the same, and that's what people really care about. And anyone who knows anything about chemistry, right, is going to be able to read right through that and say, you just said water is boiling. You know, you're not impressing the right people when you try and use jargon. So look for phrases like this: intrinsic dissimilarities, heightened scrutiny. These are phrases that I pulled out of papers that were published. And, you know, if they had said, look carefully, you know, like these are things that I've fallen into traps of using, intrinsic dissimilarities, when you could say it a lot more simply and hopefully get some more support on your side. And there's no increase in specificity by going to heightened scrutiny. That doesn't tell us anything more than look carefully. Okay, and then here's another one. So I'll give you guys a second to read this one. So are there any ideas using all of the many tools we've developed over the course of this workshop so far on how we can improve this? Just tell me one.
Instead of intrinsic dissimilarities, fundamental differences.
There we go. Haha. Someone read the last slide. Nice. Any other ideas?
I guess you don't need so many adjectives describing biological tissues and electronic systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Definitely a little repetitive. And although you and your like super specified mind, because you're all great researchers and you're in your specified minds, you know, those things might be very different to you. To the average reader, like they're like, I get it. Biology and science or technology are different, you know. Great. Any last ideas before the reveal?
I guess just going along with that for interfaces, just similar to what was said previously about not using as many adjectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Cool. So what we ended up saying is biological tissues are soft and wet, while electronic systems are rigid and dry. This makes it hard to make these interfaces. In fact, it could be really challenging. You know, I think I could give this paragraph to maybe like a 6th grader, and I think that they could walk away and be like, yeah, that makes sense. You know, but maybe that first one, I don't know if they necessarily would have, although we were all pretty smart 6th graders, right? So there's a small, it's a little bit longer, right? But you know, it was a good trade-off to make. So here's some ideas to carry with you before we go into breakout rooms. Here's some ideas to carry with you when we think about writing science. So, you know, there's some, a lot of PIs will tell you, you know, try and write your science as a story. That's how you get it into the big magazines, right? That's how, or journals, this is how you get it into, you know, you tell your story of how you developed your research. But that can sometimes border on being episodic or like, you know, and then, you know, I was thinking, you know, maybe it hit me if I just do this differently, you know, like how much storytelling should be involved. There is a line there when it becomes a little more unprofessional versus concision, right? And then I did this, then I did this, then I did this. How much of that storytelling can you fit in there? And that's a good balance to try to walk. Ask yourself that. How can science writing be made more artistic? One great thing that people are doing a lot nowadays, and all of the major journals have adopted, is graphical abstracts. And I don't know about you guys, but I love them because when I'm reading a paper, sometimes I just want a drawing. You drew it, you said, okay, I did this to these mice, and then they had this phenotype. And that's because of this gene. And you're like, oh, why didn't you just say that? You know, sometimes that graphical abstract is a really great way to exchange information. So, you know, always be on the lookout for new ways to try and make science writing more artistic, and see how you can work things like graphical abstracts into your proposals. And then finally, how can you stay focused on the main point and avoid becoming too verbose, right? This goes back to concision, this goes back to clarity, this goes back to all 5 of the C's, right? You want to get the main point across, but you want it to be clear, but you don't want too much verbiage going on. And we saw that in the last couple of examples, that sometimes when you try and make things clearer, sometimes when you try and avoid jargon, things get very wordy. So it's, again, a balancing act to perform, but I think you're all up to the challenge. So with that, I think we're ready to head into breakout rooms. So if you, oh, chat looks great. Awesome. Yes, but so if you came with a proposal that you want to work on, or you've done a proposal and you want some feedback on it, if you want to put like a 1, you can change your name and like put a 1 in your name on Zoom, and we'll put you in a breakout room where we'll give you one-on-one feedback. We'll read through your stuff. We'll kind of talk about it, see where you could have, you could clean it up a little bit, see what you did well, and have that type of discussion. And if not, we have a bunch of examples that we're going to do in the other breakout room, kind of like the ones that we've been doing, but kind of putting it all together. So I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to put the ones by your name if you are interested in that. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Sophia.
Or raise your hand, I was going to say. But if I don't see any, then I'm going to just assign people to breakout room.
Awesome. Well, it seems like we'll probably end up dismissing from breakout rooms, yeah? So if you guys have any questions before we go into breakout rooms, feel free to message me. I'll put the SciComm information in the chat if you want any of these PowerPoints or you want anything or you have any questions. Feel free to contact us. We're on Facebook, you know, send us a message, whatever works. So, all right. And whenever Sophia is ready with the breakout rooms, we'll do that then.
Does 2 breakout rooms sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Perfect. All right. There we go.